I think we shall start. I think pretty much everyone's here. Okay, so officially, hello everyone. I'm Amy. Those who've seen me know me. I'm the brand ambassador of Crystal Wines. Thank you for being punctual. And welcome to another exciting virtual tasting masterclass of ours. Today will be Flametree Wines of Margaret River. And we are honored to have the General Manager and Chief Winemaker, Cliff Royle, with us today. So as usual, before we start, just some house rules. We have muted all participants, and that is really to reduce any background noise so that we can have a smooth session together. If you have any questions for Cliff during the presentation, anytime along the way, please type them in the group chat. We will have your questions answered. I will read out to Cliff and have him answered. If you prefer to ask the questions verbally, you could also do so, let me know, or there is also a participant called Crystal Wines. That's my colleague, Cheryl. Hello, Cheryl. So she is actually helping with the slides and playing the video and all that. So let us know if you would like to ask the questions verbally. We will unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your questions. So before we begin, let's watch a lovely video of Flametree Wines.
People often ask me about Margaret River and why it's renowned for growing such great grapes and therefore making such fantastic wines. And I generally go back to three main things: the soil, which gives you fantastic fruit to work with, great intensity, and then the maritime influence with that beautiful cold afternoon breezes coming from the Great Southern Ocean. And then the consistency of vintage to vintage, which not many other wine regions can attest to. The growers we work with have a similar philosophy on producing premium fruit to make great wines. They're not looking for bulk wine or large scale production. They're looking at premium, and I think to me that's what Margaret River represents. In the growing season, September through to January, February, spend time with those growers in the vineyards, making sure that we're making the changes that were needed for the season to get the grapes exactly where we need them to make the wines come February, March when we harvest. We work with the 6 sub-regions of Margaret River. We predominantly get our fruit from the southern part of Margaret River, so aromatic whites from Carradale and Wallcliffe, Chardonnay from Wallcliffe and Carradale also, and then our reds come from Williabra with a small amount of Merlot and Shiraz coming from Yellingup. Julian, our winemaker, and myself will work really closely together. We complement each other really well. The term Yoda is a little bit that we joke about because I'm a little bit more feel for wine. He's a bit more the mad scientist. And I think to make great wine, you need a bit of Yoda and you need a bit of science. And you bring the two together and you can create something pretty interesting.
Fruit's very distinctive and site specific.
I really like the perfume of the wine. We do want a level of interest in the wines. We've definitely set about creating a style of wines that we believe represents Flametree rather than just Margaret River. And it's all about perfume, elegance and structure. Wine should be about fun. I think people get too carried away with the seriousness of wine. At the end of the day, it is just fermented grapes and people should be a little more relaxed about it. And I think this location in Margaret River is the perfect place for people to enjoy it. The cellar door is very casual, very laid back, a fun environment, a welcoming environment for people to come and taste wines. The staff are really knowledgeable. They'll offer you an experience from the novice right through to the professional. Really, we want people to be informed. We want people to have fun. We want them to go away with a memory from the cellar door about the style of wines that we make, that they're not the same as everywhere else in Margaret River.
Okay, I really like the part Cliff, where you mentioned the Yoda and mad scientist. I think it explains the core of winemaking, which is blending the art and science together. It's not just purely science or art. You got to have the feel and as well as the technical part. Yep.
Yeah.
So anyway, let me introduce Cliff a little bit. He is he's of course with 20 years of winemaking experience. He's the Margaret River specialist. He was the chief winemaker at Voyager Estate for 10 years. He has been awarded the Winemaker of the Year by Wine State magazine. He's the wine judge for numerous wine shows across Australia. And he has been named one of the best winemakers of his generation. And of course, thanks to him and his vision, Flametree today is an award-winning winery, and Crystal Wines is a proud partner. So without further ado, let's have Cliff share with us more about Flametree, what's in the name, what makes it so unique. So Cliff, over to you for the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Amy. And thanks everyone for coming along and having a listen and tasting a few wines with us today. We really appreciate your support during these really tough times that everyone's experiencing, and I think we're all getting better at doing this type of communication. So bear with us, and I'll expand a little bit on some of the information that you saw in the video. You can see that obviously this is the starting point for us with the rock formation of Margaret River and the maritime influence, and you'll hear me talk a little bit about that as we go along. But first of all, I think I should introduce the winery and the brand. We've been around a relatively short time compared to the 50 years of some of the producers, some of the pioneer producers of Margaret River. But Flametree Wines has been established since 2007, and getting their claim to fame is winning the Jimmy Watson Trophy for the best red wine at the Melbourne Wine Show with their first ever red wine, the 2007 Cabernet Merlot. So I'd spent 12 years at Voyager Estate and was looking for a change, and was asked if I would be interested in coming over to work with Flametree as winemaker and general manager. And I thought it was a lovely brand, and it had got off to a great start, and it was a bit of a blank canvas for us to be able to craft some wines with a little bit more distinctiveness from the Margaret River region rather than single vineyard wines that I'd been working with more at Voyager Estate. So we do source all our fruit from up and down the coast, and I'll show you a map of that and exactly where we get that fruit from, because it's significant when we taste the wines. But you can see this beautiful slide here. It's a really lovely part of Margaret River. It's called Williabruck Cliffs, and the reason we like this is because it plays beautifully into the next slide, that is the soil types of Margaret River. You can see this beautiful granite here, and the granite and limestone soils are what make up Margaret River. And a lot of the limestone soils are quite salty, and so it's not the best soil, whereas the granite soils that you'll see with that really red alluvial rock in it are the sort of soils that you really want to plant your vineyards on. So there are a lot of pockets within Margaret River. It's not consistent soil types, and there are strips within the region that have been isolated over the years that are better suited to growing grapes than others. And then of course the permutations for growing grapes are endless. The row orientation, the orientation of to the sun of that vineyard, the clone, the crop levels, the watering, no watering. And so the second slide here, you're seeing the type of soil that we're looking to plant on. This is that red soil, particularly that photo on the left there. This is out of our Chardonnay vineyard, which is Edinger Estate. And all our vineyards for our Chardonnay are in the southern part of Margaret River. We just think we get more citrus and pith, sort of grapefruit pith characters than we do by going further north, where I think you get more of those sort of tropical fruits, and the wines are a little bit broader. You'll also hear me talk about the shape of wines. It's something that's becoming more and more important to me as time goes on. We're not looking to make big wines here. We're making to look wines with good shape to them. And when we talk about shape, It's more about line and length and purity than it is about volume. We want freshness in the wines, but we don't want them to be big and bulky and obvious and alcoholic. We want them to be quite elegant and restrained. So we'll move on from this side, which is the soils, and we'll move into the sub-regions of Margaret River, which is really significant. And why is that? Because this is 100 kilometres long and 30 kilometres wide. So from the top part of the map where you can see the Flametree logo, that's where our cellar door is located, right on the shores of Geograph Bay. There's about a 4-degree temperature difference between north and then down here in Carradale to the south. And so that's significant in the growing season in particular. So like we said, the whites are better grown in the southern part for those finer wines, and then you want a bit more warmth for those red wines. So Willie Abrap and Yallingup and even Treaton are better options for growing more flavoursome red wines. So Chardonnay for us is all out of Wallcliffe, and then Sauvignon Blanc and Semillon is out of Wallcliffe and Carradale. And as I said in the slide, most of our Cabernet comes from Willie Abrap there. So these are just a couple of the vineyards that we source fruit from. The bottom shot is our best Chardonnay vineyard, which funnily enough goes on a southerly slope down to a dam, and it doesn't get any of the harsh afternoon sun, and that's sort of relevant when I'm talking about the Chardonnay wines maybe a little later. So we'll move on to the next shot, and this is that same vineyard that we were talking about. This is not too far from harvesting, so we're looking at January here, and you can see the growing tips are just about finished, and those vines have had minimal, if not any, water, because you can see there's still grass growing in the mid-rows, and so that'll be a year where they don't need any water. We use irrigation if and when we need to keep the grapes functioning, but irrigation is a management tool rather than something we put on, which historically, I think the Australian wine industry had a bit of reputation for using water to bump up volume, and that's not the case anymore. We're looking for the vines to function well, to put all their energy into producing grapes and not growing too vegetatively. And that's the other thing that the soils here do. They don't have a lot of organic matter, but they have a lot of essential elements and trace elements that help to grow grapevines very moderately, because you want them to put their effort into growing fruit, not into growing lots of leaves and lots of canes, and that's the key between the two. So we'll move into the next frame. So this is just a statement that I made, and I even talked about it earlier. The wines that I really like to make here, and that doesn't make it right, it doesn't make it better. The wines that we like to make here are very much a focus on elegant structure and perfume, because for me, if I have a criticism of Australian wines at some point, is that sometimes the wines can be a bit bulky and a bit fruity, a little bit warm, a little bit broad on the back palate, and they even finish with a bit of fruit sweetness. And we're trying really hard to make our wines more savoury, so we're using entirely wild ferments in our wines nowadays, and some solids in our ferments which give the wines some real structure and a bit of minerality, so that we've got that nice dry finish that we think complements food a lot better. So I think we're going to go into the first wine, and if anyone has any questions, I'll introduce the range of wines first. So Embers, which we're tasting, the Embers Sem-Sav or Sauvignon Blanc Semillon first, is a range of wines that we've created, what we call easy drinking, soft, juicy, fruit-driven, not so oak. There's no oak in these wines, or no new oak, it's all older oak, and the wines have very soft acids and soft tannin extraction for drinking now with or without food. And then we go into the Flametree core range, where we're starting to add a bit more complexity into the wines with winemaking techniques, with some introduction of the oak, and then some different types of vessels, and then cross-blending batches to give us the overall composition of the wine. And then the SRS wines are single vineyard wines, and they're our best vineyard in a given vintage from that area that we think best reflects the style of wine that Flametree make for that grape variety. And it just happens that it's always been one vineyard for the Cabernet Sauvignon, and it's been 2 vineyards for the Chardonnays, but mostly one vineyard over the last 10 years, and just twice it hasn't been good enough, and that was 2017 and 2020. We used another vineyard. So we'll go to the tasting and look at the EMBERS range first. That's the EMBERS. So if everyone's got their glass there, I'll talk more about the philosophy behind the wines rather than the actual sort of fruit flavour of the wines and those sorts of things, because everybody has their own interpretation of what they see when it comes to fruit. But the blend here, as you can see, is predominantly Sauvignon Blanc. It is from the cooler southern part of Margaret River. It has those really crisp, fresh primary fruit characters, but I see a lot of citrus. I see a lot of stone fruit. As I said, it doesn't have any oak. It's a really good food wine, but also a really good wine without food and for everyday drinking. These wines also complement a bit of spice really well. They've been the mainstay of Margaret River for many, many years. And with this maritime influence, you get beautifully fresh, clean, crisp wines, as they do in Bordeaux, with the white Bordeaux's made out of the same varieties. So Margaret River has very similar climatic indices to Bordeaux, mean degree days, and obviously with the ocean influence or the river influence. So there's a lot of similarities in the fruit flavours, particularly in some of the Sauvignon Blanc wines. When we were looking at the map of Margaret River, it was remiss of me not to mention that the thing that most influences the wines being made of this region is that maritime influence to the Indian Ocean to the left, and then Geographe Bay to the north, and then the Great Southern Ocean to the south. So those southerly breezes that we get that come off the Great Southern Ocean, they're responsible for creating purity in our wines, retaining the acidity, and those nighttime temperature drops also preserve flavours. So they're very, very important, and it is, in my opinion, the single biggest reason why Margaret River wines have that beautiful purity, but also underlying power, and it also gives the wines longevity. So certainly works slightly differently with the reds, but with the white wines, and in particular the Chardonnay wines, I think it's crucial. So if everyone's had a taste of that wine, we might move on to the Chardonnays. I might talk to the Chardonnays together, but I think it's also important to mention that we have had our 50-year anniversary not so long ago, and we are a relatively young wine region in world, I guess, compared to the rest of the world. But there are a lot of people already saying that they believe that Margaret River can lay a legitimate claim to producing the best Chardonnay wines outside of Burgundy. And it's not just the local people saying that, it's people like Jancis Robinson and James Halliday, which we've seen our wines go head to head with some pretty incredible Burgundy wines and blind tastings over the years, and they certainly they seem like they're in good company. So they're certainly not outclassed, and they've been holding their own. And the wines have that beautiful grapefruit and purity to them, and that lovely minerality, and we play to that with the style of wines we make. So both the Flametree Chardonnay 18 and also the SRS 18 are both picked early. The standard Chardonnay, or the Flametree Chardonnay, is fermented in large format and small format oak, so puncheons at 500 litres, which we think we get a bit more freshness and savouriness out of, and then the standard 225 barrels as well. This wine gets about 25% new oak and it has that really lovely citrus grapefruit, just a bit of oak influence, nice savoury notes as well. But it has that classic underlying Margaret River power as well, and you really can never escape that. And that is a hallmark of the Margaret River region.
Cliff, are you going to produce a DRC Chardonnay equivalent? At a very, very, very good price.
Yeah, that'd be nice. Look, we did a Burgundy tasting in Melbourne a couple of years ago, and James Halliday wrote an article in The Australian, and our 14 SRS happened to be sandwiched between two pretty significant wines. One was a Batard from Yves Colin Murray, and the other one was a Chevalier Montrachet from Laflave, and the wine was scored second in the tasting, and there was 40 wines, and I think there was 34 Burgundies and 6 Australian wines. And so the wines can certainly stand in that company, but it's about history, and I don't think we'll be getting $1,000 for a bottle for any time soon. I'm not saying that the wines can't stand in that company, but I think you have to earn that right, and it takes time. And it's all about getting as many people to look at the wines and come and visit Margaret River. So maybe one day.
Yeah, do more blind tasting.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think that wine's looking really good at the moment. It's in a really nice place, and it has that lovely shape that I was talking about. It's still got plenty of fruit flavour. The oak's not poking out, but it's certainly leading to some layers and textures in the wine, and a bit more complexity. It's got that classic sort of dried pear and citrus fruits that I really love in Margaret River Chardonnay, and certainly will age in the short term, and is drinking really well now.
Yeah, it also has a slight toastiness to it.
Yeah.
So it's not like totally, just pure primary fruits. It has some,
no, that's right.
I would say it also have some complexity.
Yeah, that's right. That's a little bit of the wild ferment. So since 2018, we've been wild fermenting everything, and we find that there's definitely a little bit more complexity in the wine since we've been wild fermenting. I think when you use yeast, packet yeast, you get this quite simple estery sort of yeast character, and we just find that the wild ferments with the solids seem to give more complex wines and that really lovely sort of dry extract back palate finish, which for me is a very Burgundian type character, and we really want our wines to sort of finish more like that without that really cloying sweet fruit back finish that you sometimes see on Aussie Chardonnay.
Yeah, it's definitely not big and cloying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we move on to the SRS Chardonnay, and we'll take a photo together.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Can everyone pour some SRS Chardonnay into your glass and turn on your cameras? Are you all ready? I'm going to pour some on mine now. Hope everyone's ready. And yeah, prepare to take a photo on the count of 3. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. Cheers! Your best shot, please. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's continue.
Thanks, Amy.
No problem.
So then you're getting into a wine here, which is a bit more complex. You can see it's definitely got a bit more of that sulfide influence. It's very minerally. It's got some of those sort of wild ferment complexities that you see in Burgundies, but sits beautifully with that lovely grapefruit pith. I really like this style of Chardonnay. It's 13% alcohol. It's all fermented in puncheons, which are 500 litres. And then we obviously take the best barrels to go into SRS. We've had a lot of great success with this wine. It's had a lot of really good international recognition. I think it does sneak into a few tastings because it's not what you'd normally associate with Margaret River or even Australian Chardonnay at times. I'm not saying it's not an Aussie Chardonnay, because it is, and it's certainly not a Burgundy, but it's walks somewhere between the two. And Amy mentioned before about the odour with winemaking, and you know, it's an interesting point, because the producers that I follow them every year, and not just in the good years, because everybody makes good wine in good years. It's the people who make good wine in the lesser years are the producers that you learn most from and that you follow. And I find it intriguing as a winemaker to follow the people that have a feel for wine, because they get given a different set of circumstances in a lesser year or a more difficult vintage, and they have the ability to be able to change direction and make the wines in a way that still end up getting a great result. Whereas I know a lot of winemakers who can't cope with that. They only make wine to recipe, and they follow the same techniques every year because they're more the chef type winemakers. But the people who move sideways, stop, think about what they're doing are generally the people that, for me, make the more intriguing wines. And they're the people I follow, because I find the wines from even a lesser vintage really intriguing to look at.
Yeah, I really like this. The textural part is very, I don't know how to explain it, very silky and luscious.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. And I like how it's definitely complex. It's not straightforward. Like the flavors keep evolving. The fruits come out, and then there is the savory nose, and then slowly the toastiness comes through.
Yeah, that's right. It's got a really lovely underlying power to it that sort of builds, and then you get that really lovely, what I see it, I call it a quinini type astringency. It's like that sort of gin and tonic back palate that you get where things sort of dries your mouth out a little bit. I really like that, and I think it gets your taste buds going, and you know, gets you salivating and then ready for some food. So yeah, we've certainly found that this wine's been ending up in a lot of really good restaurants across Australia over the last few years, and it's definitely developed a real following for those people who like that style of wine. And we believe that we're certainly seeing it over here, that people are going to less full flavoured wines, even with reds and whites. They're looking for medium bodied red wines and more elegant white wines, less alcohol, less oak, less malo, you know, more purity, and yeah, things that go really well with sort of modern food flavours. So that's certainly what we're seeing over in this market here.
Yeah, so a participant, Stephanie, she commented that she loves the precision and linearity of the SRS Chardonnay. So very technical, linearity. Okay,
yeah.
And she also has a question.
Yeah.
She asked, your winemaking notes indicated that you left the fruit in cold storage overnight. Is there a quality consideration here?
Absolutely.
How does the step affects the quality of the wine?
So when you hand pick fruit, so all of the SRS is hand picked. So it's our best old gin vineyard in the southern part of Margaret River in Wallcliffe, and then we hand pick it. So we start at first light, and we pick 7 tonne from that vineyard into about 350 kilos per bin. And then we take them to a cold storage, which is next to our pressing facility, and we snap chill them overnight down to 7 or 8 degrees. Now, the reason for that is because when we press that fruit, the cooler it is, the less oxidation we're going to have. And so it's very important to keep the fruit really cold because you have less oxidation. You then don't need to use any sulfur, and then you can press it off. So you load the press up, and then you can press the grapes off, get the grapes to the turbidity, which is that little bit of milkiness that they look like before they're cleaned up, and then put them straight into barrel without having to worry about them getting too warm. Because obviously the warmer any fruit is, the more it oxidizes. So it's about slowing down the rate of oxidation.
And also to not, to put less sulfur. Is that also the reason? Yeah,
that's right. So the cooler it is, the less sulfur you'll need to put into the juice. And we don't like to put a lot of sulfur in juices, obviously, because we're looking to ferment them straight away. So if you're doing wild ferment, you really don't want to be using too much sulfur in your juices. You just want to be maybe taking a tiny bit of sulfur to knock out any of the indigenous yeast that might be spoilage yeast. And then you really want to try and get your ferments going as soon as possible. So I often say to people say to me, so what does turbid juice mean? It means like the glass of wine that you've got with maybe a teaspoon of milk in it. That's a turbid juice. And that juice gives the wild yeast something, it's a nutrient to ferment with and to chew on. And so the sugar and the nutrient from that little bit of solids is what gives you that really lovely savoury back palate on this style of Chardonnay.
Interesting. And the sulfur actually, what is actually the disadvantage in terms of flavour? It just makes the wine too sulphurish.
What's the advantage?
The disadvantage of putting too much sulfur on the crop.
If you put too much sulfur dioxide in your juices, you will inhibit the wild ferment.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because the wild yeast doesn't like sulfur, and nothing like sulfur really, except dried apricots, because it's a strong preservative, and the wild ferment can't ferment with a hostile environment that's got a lot of sulfur.
Okay. I think we can move on to the next wine. And meanwhile, I don't know if other participants feel the same. I still get that really long finish of the SRS Chardonnay on my mouth.
Yeah, we just got our first 98-point score from a journalist on the East Coast, Hugh and Hook, on our 19 SRS Chardonnay. So we're pretty pleased about that. It's a wine that also just missed out on 5 trophies last week it came second. So it's obviously a style that's resonating with the gatekeepers as well. And I think as we're refining the wine styles more and more, people are really gravitating to these more savoury style wines that go really well with food. That are not so fruit powerful, but more balanced with the modern food trends that we all enjoy.
Yeah, and also not overly toasty and not overly creamy. That's what I don't really like about it.
No, it's a good point, and I don't talk about it very much, and it's probably worth mentioning. We don't use toasty oak at all. We use what they call house blend. It's a light, long toast. We use only Burgundian Coopered oak, and we only use the best oak we can get. We don't use a lot of new oak, but the oak that we do use is absolutely fantastic and comes from 2 or 3 different coopers. And we've honed in on the style of oak that really suits the style of wine that we're trying to make, because oak ultimately should complement wines. It shouldn't be obvious. You spend all this time growing beautiful fruit and then destroy it with what I call clumsy winemaking, which is around too much oak, too much malo, or too much alcohol. And that was the only reason people fell out of love with Chardonnays, because the balance of the wines was wrong. Chardonnay makes the best wines in the world, and when they're really well put together and they have great balance, they're mind-blowing. And that's no disrespect to the Riesling lovers out there, but Blanc de Blanc, Champagne, Chablis and Burgundy wines that I've drunk over the years are just completely mind-blowing. And we can't make enough Chardonnay at the moment. And I don't know whether that's the same trend in Singapore, but we are definitely having a massive resurgence as people finally realise that maybe Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc's not quite as good as they thought it was, and Chardonnay could be a good alternative.
Yeah. So you admit the Sauvignon Blanc. I love your Sauvignon Blanc, Cliff. Remember we were doing an event together last year. We sold so many of your Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon. It's lovely, yeah. But anyway, right. So to those ABCs around, those anything but Chardonnay participants, I hope you can change your mind about Chardonnay after you've tasted SRS Chardonnay. There are a lot of Chardonnay is a mass grape variety. So you have volume conscious producers who probably just focus on just producing bulk wines, but they're really quality Chardonnay, and this SRS is just
Yeah, thank you. So we'll move to the next one, which is the Cabernet Merlot. And as I said, this is a wine that, sorry, that was that previous slide. Sorry, we haven't talked about that. That's it. A Cabernet Merlot with a bit of Malbec. This is a wine that, like I said, put Flametree on the map with winning the Jimmy Watson Trophy, and has been a really popular wine in our portfolio ever since. And it's classic Margaret River, with that little bit of earthiness and really lovely sort of purple or black fruits you get from the Malbec. But primarily it's Cabernet Sauvignon. It comes from 4 separate vineyards in Williabra. It gets beautiful French oak aging for 12 months. And we want to make this wine a little bit more plush and softer, a bit more early drinking, but I'd say sort of early to mid drinking. And 17 is a vintage that's drinking early, and I really like it. It's unfortunately for the poor 17 vintage, it's sandwiched between 2016 and 2018, and 18 is considered one of, if not the best vintage that people have seen since 2001. So poor old 17 sandwiched between 2 great years, particularly on the east coast of Australia, wrote those wines off. And I tried to say to people, we'll write these wines off at your peril, because they are beautiful drinks. They are classic varietal wines, and they're drinking now. 16s and 18s will require a bit of time just to soften some of that tannin. So I really love this 17 Cab Merlot. It's done really well for us out in the trade. And again, it's drinking beautifully on its own, and it also complements food really well. Couldn't be anything but Cabernet Sauvignon. It's so much mulberry and blackcurrant, and yeah, really soft tannins. We actually released our 2017 before our 16 because we thought that the 16 needed a little bit more time. So we're actually finishing up on this vintage soon and then moving back to the 16, which confuses people in the market, but from a quality point of view is a really good decision, because 16s are a little bit more tannic and structured, whereas these wines are a little bit looser and a little bit more plush, and I think they're drinking beautifully. Has anyone got any questions they'd like to ask about that wine? Or okay, well, we might move on to the SRS Cabernet, which is a single vineyard wine. Certainly the very best of the parcels of fruit that we get from Williabra. This is from a place called Williabra Estate, funnily enough, behind Mosswood on Pusey Road. It's quite a windswept site. It's on a hill with a lot of that gravel that you saw when we were looking at the soil types early on. Very, very rocky site, very low yielding vines, very small bunches, small berries, and lots of mulberry, mocha, dark chocolate. Also get this really lovely olive tapenade and gravel character in this wine, almost quartzy sort of character. It does have plenty of structure and plenty of volume, and again is looking to me like a wine that will age for the long haul. Sort of wine that really needs a bit of decanting and a bit of food, and like I say, it's a wine that will age for 20, 30 years with good cellaring conditions.
So sorry, Cliff, just going back to the Cabernet Merlot, there's a question. So Phyllis commented that the Cabernet Merlot is really plush and plummy. What are the average age of the vines?
Yeah, someone asked that question not long ago, and we worked it out. It's about 25 years. So the oldest vines are about 32 years. And then, yeah, so the average age is 25. So some of the Malbec and Merlot comes from slightly younger vines, but the Cabernet comes from old vine.
And that contributed to probably the concentration a little?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yield is a big factor, but certainly there's no substitute for older vines when it comes to depth in red wines. I think vine age has a less impact on white wines than it does on reds. It seems to me that the red wines, particularly with the tannin structure of the wines, require a bigger root system and a little bit more canopy, so a little bit more hang time. So yeah, certainly I think that's important. So this wine gets a little bit more French oak. This is all coopered, a little bit more new French oak. We only use French oak. This is all Bordeaux coopered oak. It's about 50% new French oak, and this wine can spend up to 16 months, but anywhere between 13, 14, 15, 16 months, depending on the vintage. If it's looking like it's quite structured and tannic, we'll leave it in barrel longer. If it's looking like it's an earlier vintage, we might take it out before the fruit dries out too much with the oak. Obviously, we'll also vary the amount of new oak depending on the strength of the vintage, which is a bit of that feel that I was talking about. We were obviously looking to adjust according to the vintage. And some of these wines we've probably left on skins for a while after ferment in the past, and that's given a lot of structure to the wine, but probably at the expense of a bit of aromatic complexity. And I think more and more what we're finding is that people want drink now wines. They don't really want to put them in cellars and wait, particularly wines like Cabernet. So we're probably fermenting a bit cooler, and we're probably extracting less and making the wines more approachable as young wines, which I think is the market that we're in.
Yeah, but
that said,
saying, Cliff, you're also saying this is ageable for 10 years.
Absolutely. I mean, depending on who you believe. I mean, I think with that Halliday review, he was talking about it being able to age to 2042 or something. So like I said, the 16 vintage and the 18 vintage just have this underlying tannin power, which is going to ensure that they're going to have long cellaring potential.
Yeah, so I guess the difference between old world and newer wines, I mean, I don't know whether I can make that generalization, but you talk about Bordeaux wines, it's when you drink them young, they are just undrinkable. They don't have that concentration, or somehow they're just not balanced. It's just tannins and nothing else comes through. And when you age it, then you know somehow the fruits emerge. Not sure. Yeah, but for your wine, this is, yes, I agree, it has that tannins and structure, which makes probably that it can have the ageability, but it's so drinkable now. The concentration.
Yeah, I think you get that with Australian red wines, and there is something about those French wines that do need a bit more time. But if I look at them from a scientific point of view, that quite often have a bit more acid, and that needs a little bit more time to settle down with the tannin. We've certainly changed the way we're making the wines over the last 10 years in Margaret River without leaving the wines as structured as they once were, because historically these wines can age for 30, 40 years pretty comfortably. But I think we all understand that not many people are prepared to wait 30 or 40 years. And also, 99% of people drink wine within 24 hours of purchase. So if we're making red wines to age for 30 years for 1% of the population, then that's not very good business. And it doesn't really make sense. So we certainly understand that Cabernet by nature has a lot of tannin and will age really well, but at the same time it should be approachable. And so we're definitely making the wines a lot more approachable nowadays than we were, say, 10 years ago.
Yeah, and we definitely, I agree with you. We don't have the patience in general.
No, it's a long time to wait, isn't it? Somebody just asked a question about whether or not we like to pick all our grapes early. we only pick our whites early. So reds need time. They need what we call hang time. And the important thing with red wines is that you can't rush the maturation of the tannins in reds. And it's funny because the wine critics always go crazy for the warm vintages. And yet the warm vintages age quickly and are actually have green fruit behind them. And I think they've even found that in Bordeaux, because the tannins and the sugars need to ripen together. When the tannins leave the sugars and the sugars go above the tannins, they never catch up. And so the wines look great early because they've got sugar sweetness from ripe fruit, but the tannin ripeness isn't there. It's masked early on from the sweetness and voluptuousness of the warm vintage, but then behind that you get this vegetal green character that comes through as the wine ages. So I always say to people, it's those long Indian summer vintages that are the best vintages for Cabernet. It's been warm without being too hot, and you can pick when you need to, sometime in March or April, rather than being in any hurry. And you need to watch the tannin maturation with the sugar, not in a hot year. They're not necessarily the best vintages. And I'm not saying they're not good wines, because we won a Jimmy Watson with an 07, and that wine now, if you can find a good bottle, looks pretty tired. And our 2011 SRS Cabernet was one of the more successful wines we've made, but that wine doesn't look that great now because, again, you're seeing some of that vegetative greenness in the background. So, yeah.
So we really, as consumers, we really need to know when to drink, whether to drink now or later, or this is difficult.
Yeah, it's a very different, it's probably the most difficult question that I get asked at these sort of things. How long should I cellar the wine for? And what will I expect if I love it now? Will it be as good? Will it be the same? Obviously, it won't be the same. But I say to people, you should really drink wines and monitor their progress. So if you love a wine, don't leave it too long. And if you're fortunate enough to have a few bottles, then you can check on it. Obviously, if the wine's in perfect cellaring conditions, you can have a bit more confidence. But the number of people I know that buy wines and then put them somewhere and think they'll get better and then open them up and are disappointed because the wine's lost all that beautiful fruit flavour and purity and perfume that you fell in love with, and it's developed a whole host of secondary earthy tobacco notes and all the like, and sometimes it's not what people are looking for. So I always say to people, sell a wine with caution. You may be disappointed and you may not get out of it what you think you're getting out of it. So yeah, be careful.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a question from Phyllis. She has two questions. First is, what are your thoughts of organic and biodynamic practices? And her second question is, during a hot year, do you practice acidification, or do you prefer to harvest earlier to retain the acids? Yeah,
look, the first one, I'll answer the second question first. We don't add acid, and that's one of the reasons why we pick early. And the other thing is, if you're a heavy Merlot user in Margaret River where you're converting your acid, you will generally need to add acid. And that's one of the reasons why we don't do any Merlot with our Chardonnays. We like to pick early with natural acidity and preserve that acidity. And our reds are the same. We will pick them on acid alone if we have to, because the flavours will definitely be there. It's a matter of not letting them drop too far. And if you need to use acid, you need to get it in as soon as possible. If you start making acid additions later, then you can see them. So early additions, if you absolutely need to in a hot year like 07, 11, I know that people had to add acid in those years because the acid dropped out so quickly and the wines weren't physiologically ripe. So we certainly haven't done for a long time. We go back to 2011 would be the last time that we had to add a bit of tartaric acid. And look, the second question is a good one, and again, we get asked this a lot. We've been working towards a more sustainable wine industry for a long time now, not just in the winery, but also in the vineyards. And we work with growers that need to make a living, and so we're very mindful of not asking them to sacrifice the potential of their living by going down practices that can endanger the grape harvest in general. And some of those are obviously going down a biodynamic approach. If you own your own property and you make your own wine, then you can go down the biodynamic path. And I think we've seen some incredible wines made with a biodynamic philosophy. But we're more about sustainability and organics. Certainly our wineries are certified organic, and we work with some organic fruit already. We've actually made a Cabernet this year out of organically certified fruit, and we as a team harvested the fruit by hand, and we pruned the vines, and we did all the canopy work, and so we're calling it Team Flametree Cabernet, which is just a bit of an insight for everyone in the business to understand the growing behind making the wine, and then everyone buying into the sort of practices around it. We are very, very fortunate in Margaret River that because of our climate, we don't have to use pesticides, insecticides and fungicides. We use copper and sulfur, elemental copper and sulfur, and they are considered organic compounds. So we've been very fortunate to not need to use those products for a long time. But in a year where you've got wet conditions, you may need to use a fungicide to protect against botrytis or powdery mildew, and that's everyone's prerogative to be able to protect their crops if they need to. We don't encourage that, obviously. The industry is moving away from any types of additives in the vineyards and wineries. We're all moving towards sustainable wineries with lots of rainwater tanks, solar panels, recycling, using different types of fining agents. So everyone's moving away from using eggs and, the sturgeon gut, which was a fining agent called isinglass. All those sorts of things have been taken into consideration as we move forward into the modern world we live in.
Yeah, and then it's a really tough decision actually, because if you're sick. If you have a bad vintage, you need to take antibiotics. That's too bad, right? You can't just let your crops.
That's right. And so there's certain things that you need to do, and obviously not everybody can go down a biodynamic approach. And I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that biodynamics builds tolerance, but it takes a long time. And it's interesting, I know that people who use fungicides on some of their fruit end up getting more botrytis using a fungicide than people who don't use botrytis. So I think what happens is you weaken your vineyards sometimes by trying to protect them and not letting them build their own resilience. So I don't think it's as well known yet, but I think we'll learn a lot more in years to come.
Okay, so Chris asked if we should decant the reds, the Flametree range as well.
It's a really good question, and it's one of the things I absolutely love. I love decanting all wines. I love decanting Chardonnays in particular because they are bound in, and oxygen is good for them. It relaxes them. We all know how important it is for us. The wine relaxes once it's had some oxygen. And you know what else? It also gets an opportunity to blow off some of that sulfur dioxide. And I say to people, if you ever have an allergic reaction to a wine, it's more than likely going to be because of the free sulfur dioxide. And decanting wines can avoid some of that free sulfur. Put it in a decanter, give it a splash around, and you'll even smell that. It can sometimes be quite overwhelming. It can be quite a big hit. and the wines will benefit from it because the fruit will then relax and come out of the wine, and you'll also get rid of some of the preservative. I absolutely encourage it.
For your wines only, or for wines?
For all wines.
For
all wines.
Interesting.
I don't know, you have to be careful with older wines because they can obviously oxidize quite quickly. But certainly for young wines, any wines that you know are going to have a bit of sulfur in them, or they might smell a little bit sulfitic, they will be the sort of wines that you should definitely decant and get a bit of air into as soon as you can.
Okay, very good. So we have another comment that the SRS wines blow me away. That's from Eileen. Thank you very much. And I think Stephanie also made a comment earlier that, yeah, the SRS's finish is supreme. I think she was referring to the Chardonnay. So the acid was fresh, very Burgundian in style. Just a touch of fruit. Yeah,
I've spent a lot of money buying, well, back in the day when I could afford it, Coast Jury and Rouleau, and of recent times, Yves Colin Murray has become my favourite producer because I can't get those other two anymore. I used to be in love with the Laflave wines of yesteryear, and there are a few others as well. But those sort of wines have really taught me about pulling the fruit back a little bit and making the wines a little more restrained and a little more textured and layered and intriguing and interesting. I just think there's a lot of sameness about Margaret River Chardonnay sometimes, and I think it's great to define your own style and support that. And sometimes it takes a little while to get the support from the greater wine world, but certainly that SRS wine now has a very strong following, and we've got a few customers in the UK who buy it pretty regularly.
So while you were talking, the customer asked if your style of winemaking is typically representative of Margaret River, which you partly mentioned that you try not to be, and to create your own style. And I think you're more Burgundian, Coach Jury inspired.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember a pivotal moment when I was at Voyager Estate and somebody said to me, "But you guys share a common boundary with Lewin Estate. Why don't you make Lewin Chardonnay?" And I said, "Well, because Lewin make Lewin Chardonnay. That'd be silly. We make Voyager Chardonnay." And we set about deliberately trying to make a different style of wine that we thought was a little finer, a little more pure. We played around with some of the Burgundian clones and created a style that became, the Voyager style of Chardonnay. And it's an interesting question when people say that. It'd be a boring industry if we all made the same wine. And I think as a producer, you need to have your own style. And Chardonnay is one of those wines that you really can create your own wine style, your own thumbprint, because it's an incredible great variety to work with, and so many different nuances and so many different permutations for what you can add or take or leave out or put in. But you still have to have good fruit.
Okay, so what do you have for the next slide?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, that's a little bit that we've already mentioned, the sort of accolades. It's always really difficult for me to talk about the awards with the wines, but certainly of recent times, the Chardonnays have been getting some great reviews with, Wine Spectator and with James Suckling, and in the domestic market as well, some really big scores from some of the wine journalists that can sort of see where we're heading with that SRS Chardonnay. And I'm pretty excited by the 17 and 18 SRSs to come after this 16. I think we're just starting to get a bit more of a handle on that wine, and I'm really happy with the 16. I think it's drinking beautifully and it's a really good vintage. But I think you'll see some even better Cabernets coming from us in the future.
That's good. So Eileen was also commenting about the SRS. She asked whether it's a new collection because she remember when she was there, I believe she visited your cellar door. She
Yeah.
didn't taste that. So it's well done and she's loving it. I think it speaks a lot about terroir, right? Since SRS is really...
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we don't use a lot of heavy toast oak again on our Cabernet. We want that gravelly tannin, Cabernet tannin to express itself because we think it's really important. And I'm unashamedly, again, trying to make a claret style Cabernet. I'm not looking for big show success style, sweet, broad, fruited wines. We want to make classic, elegant, perfumed Cabernet that has longevity, but also can be drunk now, probably with food, almost certainly, because Cabernet just has this beautiful core of really light, fine tannin, but it just goes all the way to the back of the palate. So it's quite strong, and on its own, it can be a little bit much, but with food, you don't even notice the tannins. And so that bit of protein, however you have it, is pretty important for breaking that tannin down. Yeah.
I think that pretty much ends the session. What's the next slide, Cheryl?
Yeah, this is our cellar door, and this is, I know that at the moment we're all unfortunately locked away and none of us can travel anywhere, and I'd normally be travelling around the world and travelling to the East Coast, and many of you would probably be August, September. I know some of our biggest customers to Margaret River. Singaporeans have always been great travellers, and we're just saying to you that next time you're here, we hope you can come and visit our cellar door. We've got a beautiful cellar door on the shore of Geograph Bay. We'd love to see you come and taste some of the wines that we don't export. We do a lot of small batch, interesting single varietal sort of wines that we play around with that are for our cellar door and mail list customers only. So we'd love to see you pop in and say hello. And we also, obviously, through Crystal Wines, can ship wines to you direct.
Okay, I think that pretty much ends our session. I don't think we have any more Q&A coming. So yes, that's pretty much the end. Thank you very much, Cliff, for your time, and it was a very good tasting session. Yet again, I learned a lot from you, as usual, those technical terms about good vintage and really hot vintage and the effects on the tannins and the drinkability. Yeah, this is something new for me. I'm sure all the participants has enjoyed the session thoroughly. So moving on to the next slide, Cheryl. For those of you who are interested to purchase our wines, they are now on special offer for just 2 weeks. So visit www.crystalwines.com for the Flametree Wines offers. And if you enjoyed the session that we had, do share with your friends and family on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, as well as Telegram to receive more information on our upcoming virtual tasting sessions. And and if you have any feedback at all, do send it to us for improvements, or if you want to compliment the way we arrange our virtual tasting, feel free to do so. Send your feedback to marketing@crystalwines.com. Thank you so much again, Cliff, for the session. Thank you.
No problem at all, Amy. Thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all the Crystal Wine team